The dust in the cabin was a living thing. It settled on the warped floorboards, coated the single clouded window pane, and mingled with the sour scent of her stepfather's corn liquor. Clara had learned long ago not to stir it. She learned to move like a ghost through the two small rooms that made up her world, to keep her breathing shallow and her head down. At 17, she was a creature of silence and shadows, taught by a heavy hand that a girl's worth was measured in her ability to be unseen and unheard. That afternoon, the silence was broken by the arrival of a man whose shadow fell long and dark through the open doorway. His name was Silas Blackwood, a traveling merchant with eyes like chips of flint and a beard stained yellow with tobacco juice. He did not look at Clara, not at first. His business was with Jebediah, her stepfather, who sat hunched over the rickety table, his knuckles white around a tin cup. "The deal stands," Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. He placed a heavy sack on the floor. It landed with a soft, promising thud. Flour, enough to last a month, maybe more. Next to it, he laid a silver watch, its chain pooling like a dead snake on the rough wood. The watch gleamed in the sliver of sunlight cutting through the gloom. It was more wealth than Clara had ever seen in one place. Jebediah's gaze, bleary and red-rimmed, darted from the flour to the watch and then, finally, to Clara. In his eyes, she saw no flicker of fatherly affection, no hint of regret. She saw only the dull, calculating appraisal of a man weighing livestock. She was the final piece of the transaction. "She's yours," Jebediah rasped, pushing his chair back. He did not get up. He did not offer a handshake or a farewell. He simply took the watch, his grimy fingers closing around its smooth, cool surface. He had already forgotten her. Clara stood frozen by the cold hearth, her worn calico dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the thing she had dreaded in the deepest, quietest hours of the night, the fear that had been her constant companion since her mother had succumbed to fever 2 winters past. To be sold. The word was a brand, searing itself into her soul. She was not a daughter, not a person. She was a debt paid, a bargain struck. Blackwood finally turned his flinty eyes on her. He looked her up and down. A slow, dismissive inventory. "Get your things," he commanded. Her things. A faded shawl her mother had woven and a small, crudely carved wooden bird Jebediah had made for her long ago, in a time before the liquor had soured his heart completely. They were in a small bundle under her cot. She retrieved them without a word, her movements stiff with a terror so profound it felt like ice in her veins. She did not look at her stepfather as she walked out of the cabin and into the blinding, indifferent sun. She did not look back. The silver watch had already replaced her. The journey with Silas Blackwood was a blur of dust and jolting motion. He had a sturdy wagon, and he made her sit in the back with the barrels of salted pork and bolts of cloth. He spoke to her only to give orders. "Draw water from the creek. Mind the fire. Stay put." He was not cruel in the way Jebediah had been. There were no angry words or sudden blows. His was a cruelty of indifference. She was cargo. Nothing more. She ate hardtack and dried meat, drank lukewarm water from a canteen, and slept on the hard wagon bed under a blanket that smelled of dust and horses. For days, they traveled across a vast, unforgiving landscape. The sun beat down, blistering the earth and her spirit. At night, the coyotes yipped and howled, their lonely cries echoing the desolation in her own heart. She clutched the wooden bird in her pocket, its smooth shape a small, secret comfort in a world that had become sharp and hostile. Finally, they arrived in a town called Redemption. It was a cruel name for a place that offered none. It was a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together on a dusty plain, with a single wide street that seemed to lead from nowhere to nowhere. The air was thick with the smell of manure, stale beer, and despair. Men with hard, sun-crinkled eyes watched the wagon pass, their gazes lingering on Clara with a kind of lazy curiosity that made her skin crawl. Blackwood pulled the wagon to a halt in front of a 2-story building that called itself a hotel, but looked more like a glorified barn. A man was waiting on the porch, leaning against a post. He was older, perhaps 50, with a belly that strained the buttons of his waistcoat and a face flushed with drink. His hair was slicked back with a greasy pomade, and a drooping mustache failed to hide the mean set of his mouth. This was Mr. Abernathy, her groom. "So, this is the girl," Abernathy said, his voice thick and phlegmy. He stepped off the porch and walked around to the back of the wagon, peering at Clara as if she were a horse he was considering buying. "She's a bit scrawny, ain't she?" "She's healthy," Blackwood replied, his tone all business. "And she's got no people to come looking for her. Clean as a whistle." Abernathy grunted and reached into the wagon, his thick fingers closing around Clara's arm. He hauled her out, and she stumbled, her legs stiff from the long ride. He held her steady, his grip painfully tight. His breath smelled of whiskey and onions. "She'll do, I suppose. A man gets tired of his own cooking." He released her arm and tossed a small, heavy purse to Blackwood. The deal was done, again. Mr. Abernathy's home was a small, grimy house behind the town's general store. He showed her to a room at the back. It was hardly a room at all, just a narrow space with a lumpy cot, a bucket for washing, and a single small window that was nailed shut. There was a lock on the outside of the door. He made it clear that this was her place. She was his bride, he said, but the word felt like a lie. In his eyes, she was a servant, a possession, something he had bought and paid for. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Mr. Abernathy expected his meals on time, his floors scrubbed, his laundry washed. Clara, who had never been taught any of these things, fumbled through the chores. She burned the biscuits, scrubbed the floors with too much lye until the wood was pale and splintered, and shrank his wool shirt in the wash. Each mistake earned her a string of curses or a sharp cuff to the head. She learned quickly to fear the sound of his heavy footsteps, the smell of whiskey on his breath. She ate her meals alone in her small room, listening to him move about the house, her body tense with a constant, simmering fear. He told her the wedding would be on Saturday. The justice of the peace would say the words at the saloon. It was the only place in town big enough for a proper celebration, he'd said with a wet, self-satisfied laugh. A celebration of what? Clara wondered. The final closing of her cage. He brought her a dress. It was made of cheap, shiny satin, a garish shade of blue that made her skin look sallow. It was too big in the waist and too tight in the shoulders. When she put it on, she felt like a doll, a thing to be dressed up and displayed. On the day of her forced wedding, the sun was a merciless white fire in the sky. Mr. Abernathy was already drinking, his mood expansive and loud. He grabbed her arm and pulled her from the house, marching her down the dusty street toward the saloon. Her shoes, a pair of his late wife's that were 2 sizes too big, pinched her feet with every step. The town watched them go. Faces peered from windows. Men stopped their conversations to stare. She saw no kindness in their eyes, only a dull, morbid curiosity. She was a spectacle, a piece of local gossip. The saloon was a cacophony of noise and smells. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and spilled liquor. A tinny piano was being played badly in the corner. "Mr." Abernathy dragged her to the bar, shouting for whiskey. He pushed a glass into her hand. "Drink up, little bride. It's your wedding day." The raw liquor burned her throat, and she choked, tears springing to her eyes. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Across the crowded room, a man sat alone at a small table, nursing a beer. He was lean and quiet, with sun-weathered skin and a stillness about him that was at odds with the noisy room. His clothes were plain, the durable garb of a rancher or a farmer. He wasn't watching her, not directly, but she felt his presence like a patch of cool shade in the oppressive heat of the room. "Mister!" Abernathy grew louder and more belligerent with each drink. He put his arm around Clara, his hand squeezing her shoulder. "Ain't she a pretty thing?" he bellowed to the men at the bar. "Quiet, too. Knows her place." His hand slipped from her shoulder, and he pinched her cheek. Hard. "Gonna make a fine wife. Obedient." Clara flinched, pulling her head away. The movement was small, instinctive, but it was enough to ignite Mr. Abernathy's temper. "Don't you pull away from me, girl," he snarled, his face darkening. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "I paid good money for you. You do as I say." He raised his hand, the back of it poised to strike her face. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow. But it never came. "That's enough." The voice was low and calm, yet it cut through the din of the saloon like a blade. Clara opened her eyes. The quiet rancher was standing beside them. He hadn't moved quickly, but he was there, his tall frame blocking Mr. Abernathy's path. He wasn't looking at Clara. His steady, gray eyes were fixed on the older man. "Mr. Abernathy's face contorted with drunken rage. "This ain't your business, friend. This is my wife." "She ain't your wife yet," the rancher said, his voice even. "And even if she was, that's no way to treat a lady." "I'll treat her how I please," Abernathy roared, and he shoved the rancher. It was a foolish move. The rancher was solid as an oak tree. He barely moved. The shove, however, was all it took to ignite the tinderbox. A chair scraped back, a man shouted something, and then the room erupted. It wasn't a grand, heroic brawl. It was a clumsy, desperate scuffle. Men pushed and shouted. A glass shattered. Mr. Abernathy, blind with rage, swung a wild punch at the rancher, who sidestepped it easily. Abernathy, off balance, stumbled backward, tripping over an overturned stool. His head hit the edge of the bar with a sickening crack. He went down in a heap and did not move. For a moment, the room was silent. All eyes were on the crumpled figure on the floor. In that sliver of silence, Clara saw her chance. Her heart screamed, "Run!" She didn't think. She just moved. She slipped through the stunned crowd, her satin dress catching on a splintered table. She wrenched it free, hearing the fabric tear. She burst through the swinging saloon doors and into the harsh sunlight. Her ill-fitting shoes twisted on her feet, and she kicked them off, not breaking her stride. The street was hot and sharp with stones, but she didn't feel it. Adrenaline was a fire in her blood. She ran, barefoot and terrified, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and that saloon. She ducked into the alley between the saloon and the stables, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She found a space behind a rain barrel, a dark, narrow gap, and squeezed into it. Pulling her knees to her chest, she trembled uncontrollably. The torn blue dress a ridiculous flag of her humiliation. Every sound, the nicker of a horse, the distant shout of a man, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. They would come for her. The whole town would hunt her down and drag her back to him. She was property. She had run away. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds of the saloon died down, replaced by the normal, lazy afternoon hum of the town. She stayed hidden, cramped and shivering, convinced that every passing shadow was someone coming to find her. Then, a pair of worn leather boots appeared in her line of sight. They stopped a few feet from her hiding place. She held her breath, her heart seizing in her chest. A long silence. Then, a voice. The same low, calm voice from the saloon. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." It was the rancher. Luke. She had heard someone call his name during the scuffle. He crouched down, moving slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal. She could see his face now. It was a kind face, she thought, Despite the stern set of his jaw, there were lines of sadness around his eyes. He didn't try to pull her out. He simply shrugged off his heavy canvas coat and held it out to her. "You're shaken. You'll catch a chill when the sun goes down." She stared at the coat, then at him. She had expected anger, accusations. She had expected to be dragged back to the saloon, to the sheriff, to Mr. Abernathy. She did not expect this quiet act of kindness. Hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and took the coat. It was warm from his body and smelled of hay and clean earth. She pulled it around her shoulders, the rough fabric a surprising comfort. "Come on," he said softly, standing up. "My wagon's just over here. Let's get you away from this place." He led her, not back to the main street, but through the back of the stables, where a simple buckboard wagon was hitched to a sturdy-looking mare. He helped her up onto the seat, his touch on her elbow gentle and respectful. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft cluck of his tongue, set the horse into a walk. They rolled out of town without a word, leaving the dust and despair of redemption behind them. The silence in the wagon was vast, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the steady clop of the horse's hooves. Clara sat rigid, clutching the coat around her. She kept waiting for him to speak, to demand something of her, to explain what he wanted in return for this rescue. But he said nothing. He just kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile etched against the setting sun. They traveled for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into a rugged, empty land of rolling hills and sparse, hardy trees. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air grew cold. As darkness fell, a scattering of stars appeared in the vast, inky sky. Clara had never felt so small, or so strangely safe. Finally, she saw a light in the distance, a single, flickering yellow square. As they drew closer, she could make out the shape of a small house and a barn, nestled in a hollow between two hills. It was a lonely, isolated place. Luke pulled the wagon to a halt near the house and set the brake. "We're here," he said. He helped her down, and she followed him onto the porch. He opened the door, and a wave of cool, still air washed over her. He lit a lantern on the table, and the room filled with a soft, golden light. It was a simple, clean space. There was a large stone fireplace, a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding books and dishes. It was a man's home, stark and functional, but there was a quiet order to it that was calming. In one corner, a rocking chair sat empty. A faded quilt draped over its back. It looked like it had been waiting for someone who was never coming back. Luke gestured to one of the chairs at the table. "Sit, I'll get you some water." She sat, her hands clutching her knees. She watched him as he moved to the water pump in the corner, his movements economical and sure. He brought her a cup of cool, clear water. She drank it greedily, her throat raw and dry. He sat in the other chair, the table between them. The silence returned, stretching and filling the small room. It was too much for her. The kindness, the quiet, the not knowing. It was more terrifying than the anger she was used to. She had to break it. She had to know what he wanted, what her price was this time. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a raw, shaky whisper. I don't have anything to pay you with." He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the lantern light. "I'm not asking for payment." The words hung in the air, so foreign to her experience that she could barely comprehend them. Her fear twisted into a different shape, a knot of shame and worthlessness in the pit of her stomach. She had to make him understand. She had to warn him what a poor bargain he had made. "You don't understand," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm no good for anything. My stepfather, Mr. Abernathy, they wanted a bride, someone to cook and clean and keep a house. But I don't know how. I don't know how to do any of it. I burn everything I cook, and I don't know how to mend or sew or anything. I don't know how to be anyone's bride." She finished, her breath catching in a sob, her eyes fixed on the wooden tabletop. She had laid her uselessness bare. Now he would see, now he would take her back. Luke was silent for a long time. She risked a glance at him. He was looking at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of profound sadness in his eyes, a grief that seemed as vast and empty as the land outside. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it held a weight that settled deep in her bones. "I didn't save you for that," he said simply. "I just couldn't walk away." The first morning at Luke's homestead, Clara woke to a profound and unnerving silence. For years, her mornings had been defined by the sounds of a drunken man stumbling about, of muttered curses and the clink of a bottle. Here, there was only the gentle whisper of the wind moving through the tall grass outside and the distant, lonely call of a meadowlark. It was a silence that felt both empty and full of promise. Luke was already gone. A half-empty cup of coffee left on the table evidence of his early start. A plate with a piece of cornbread and a slice of bacon was covered with a clean cloth, left for her. She ate slowly, every bite a small miracle of provision she had not earned. The food settled a fear deep inside her, but it also fueled a desperate, gnawing need to be useful. She could not be a burden. A burden was a thing to be discarded. Her attempts to help were a study in awkward futility. She decided to feed the chickens, remembering how her mother used to do it. But when she unlatched the coop, the small flock exploded outwards in a flurry of squawking feathers. A formidable black rooster with a fiery comb and suspicious eyes lowered his head and stared at her. A tiny, feathered tyrant. She threw the grain at them in a panicked heap and fled back to the safety of the house, her heart pounding. Next, she tried drawing water from the well. The heavy wooden bucket seemed determined to fight her, banging against the stone sides as she lowered it. When she finally hauled it up, sloshing and heavy, she managed to spill half of it on the dusty ground and her own feet before she got it to the kitchen. She stood over the half-empty bucket, her shoulders slumped in defeat, the cold water soaking the hem of the dress Luke's wife had worn. Luke never criticized. When he found her later in the small vegetable patch, staring in dismay at a perfectly good carrot she had mistaken for a weed, he did not sigh or scold. He simply crouched beside her, his large, calloused hands gently taking the carrot from her. "This one's a keeper," he said, his voice low and even. He pointed to a plant with spiky leaves. "That's thistle. That's the one you want to pull. See the difference?" He showed her how to grip the weed at its base and pull steadily. So the root came with it. He worked beside her for a while, not speaking, their shared silence a form of quiet instruction. She learned more from his patience in that single hour than she had from a lifetime of Jebediah's angry demands. The land around them was a harsh and beautiful teacher. The wind was a constant presence, a restless spirit that swept down from the hills, stealing the moisture from her skin and whipping strands of her brown hair across her face. The sun was relentless, turning her pale skin a tender pink before it deepened into a light tan. Her hands, once soft and unused, grew rough and blistered from the well rope and the garden tools. Some nights, the coyotes would begin their chorus, a series of yips that escalated into wild, mournful howls that seemed to claw at the edges of the small, lonely homestead. At first, the sound terrified her, a symphony of all the wild, dangerous things that lived in the dark. But as the weeks passed, she began to find a strange comfort in it. The coyotes, the wind, the sun. They were not cruel. They were simply true. They demanded strength, and in trying to meet that demand, Clara began to feel a strength she never knew she possessed. For the first time in her life, she felt the solid ground beneath her feet. She felt alive. But the past was a stubborn ghost. It haunted her sleep, replaying its horrors in vivid, suffocating detail. She would dream of her stepfather's cabin, the air thick with the smell of cheap liquor and stale regret. She would feel the cold, assessing stare of Silas Blackwood, the merchant who had transported her like a sack of grain. Worst of all were the dreams of Mr. Abernathy, his fleshy face looming over her, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her cheek. She would wake with a choked gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the thin cotton of her nightgown clinging to her skin. One night, a particularly violent dream ripped a scream from her throat. She sat bolt upright on her cot, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. The door to her small room creaked open, and Luke was there, a silhouette against the moonlit square of the main room. He didn't come closer. He just stood in the doorway, a silent guardian. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She could only nod, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to stop the violent trembling that shook her frame. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a dipper of water. He set it on the small crate beside her cot. "Just a bad dream." He said it wasn't a question. She found her voice, a small, ragged thing. He was touching me." Luke's silhouette stiffened. A long moment passed. "No one's gonna touch you here," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You're safe." He stood there for a few more minutes, a still, reassuring presence in the dark, until her breathing evened out and the frantic beating of her heart began to slow. He never asked what she dreamed about. He never pressed for details. But when she spoke of it, he listened, and his listening was a balm to her wounded soul. Her own dress, the one she'd been sold in, was beyond repair. The fine blue satin dress from the wedding was a tattered ruin, with a trembling heart. She had opened the large cedar chest at the foot of Luke's bed, knowing what she would find inside. It felt like a desecration, a violation of a sacred space. Inside, neatly folded, were a woman's clothes, simple calico work dresses, a finer wool dress for church, soft cotton nightgowns. They smelled faintly of dried lavender. Sarah, Luke's wife. Out of sheer necessity, Clara had taken one of the plainest work dresses, a faded gingham of pale yellow. It hung a little loose in the shoulders, but it was clean and whole. She put it on, feeling like an imposter, a thief stealing the ghost of another woman's life. She spent the entire day dreading the moment Luke would see her. He came in from the barn as the sun was setting, his face tired and streaked with dirt. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes falling on her. She saw it then, a flicker of raw pain in his gaze, so swift and deep it was like a physical blow. He looked away, his jaw tight. Clara's hands flew to the buttons at her throat, her face burning with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My dress, it was torn. I can take it off. I shouldn't have—" "No." His voice was quiet but firm, stopping her frantic apology. He looked at her again, his eyes holding a universe of old grief, but also a startling gentleness. He took a slow breath. "You're not replacing anyone," he said, his words measured and soft. "You're surviving." With those words, he gave her more than permission to wear a dress. He gave her permission to be there, to take up space in this house that was so full of loss. He acknowledged her struggle, her need, and separated it from his own tragedy. She was not a replacement. She was a survivor. And in that moment, something inside her that had been brittle and broken began to feel the first, tentative possibility of mending. The isolation of the homestead could not last forever. They were running low on flour, salt, and coffee. Luke announced one morning that he had to ride into Redemption for supplies. A cold dread settled in Clara's stomach. She begged him not to go, but they both knew it was necessary. He was gone the entire day. Clara spent it in a state of high anxiety, watching the horizon, imagining all the things that could go wrong. She imagined Mr. Abernathy seeing him, the sheriff arresting him, a mob coming back to the ranch. When he finally returned late in the evening, the set of his jaw was harder than usual. He was quiet as he unloaded the supplies, and she knew something had happened. Gossip, he told her later, was spreading like a prairie fire. Abernathy had woken up with a sore head and a story that grew more elaborate with each telling. In his version, Luke had attacked him without provocation and stolen his lawfully acquired bride. The town, always hungry for a scandal, had devoured the story. Men who had known Luke for years now looked at him with suspicion. Women whispered behind their hands as he passed. He was no longer just a grieving widower. He was a troublemaker, a man harboring a runaway. The proof of that arrived a few days later in the form of a lone rider. Luke saw him from the barn, a glint of sun on a tin star. "Deputy," he said, his voice flat. He came to the house, his movements urgent but controlled. "Clara, get to the barn, the hayloft. Do not make a sound until he's gone." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She scrambled up the ladder to the loft, burrowing deep into the sweet-smelling hay until she was completely hidden, leaving only a tiny gap to peer through. The deputy, a tall man with a drooping mustache and weary eyes, dismounted and met Luke in the yard. His name was Miller. "Luke," the deputy said, his tone professional but strained. "Gotta ask you a few questions." "Always have time for the law, Ben," Luke replied, his voice calm. He leaned against a fence post, looking for all the world like a man with nothing to hide. "It's about Abernathy. He's filed a complaint. Says you assaulted him and absconded with a girl he was set to marry." Abernathy was drunk and belligerent, Luke said evenly. "He was going to hit the girl. I stepped in. He tripped and hit his head. That's all there was to it." "And the girl? He says you took her." From her hiding place, Clara held her breath. The hay smelled sharp and dusty. A spiderweb tickled her cheek. "The girl ran," Luke said, his voice unwavering. "Soon as Abernathy went down, she bolted. I haven't seen her since. For all I know, she's halfway to the next territory by now." The lie was so smooth, so absolute. It sent a shiver through Clara. He was lying to the law. For her, risking everything. Deputy Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Luke, I've known you a long time. You're not a liar, but folks are talking. Abernathy is making a stink. If you are harboring her, you're breaking the law. It would be better for everyone if you just turned her over." "There's no one to turn over, Ben," Luke said, his gaze as steady as the hills behind him. "I'm telling you the truth." They spoke for a few more minutes, the deputy's questions becoming more pointed, Luke's answers remaining simple and unshakable. Finally, with another heavy sigh, the deputy mounted his horse. "All right, Luke, but if I find out you're lying to me, there'll be trouble." He rode away. Clara stayed hidden until Luke came into the barn and called her name softly. She climbed down the ladder, her legs shaking so badly she almost fell. He caught her elbow to steady her. She looked up at him, her throat too tight to speak. He had stood between her and the world. He had lied for her. No one had ever done that before. No one had ever thought she was worth protecting. That night, a storm rolled in. The wind, which was usually a constant whisper, rose to a furious howl. It battered the small house, rattling the window panes and shrieking down the chimney. It sounded like a pack of wolves, hungry and circling. They sat in the main room, the fire in the hearth the only source of light and warmth. The flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The storm outside seemed to mirror the one inside Clara's heart. The deputy's visit had made their situation clear. They were living on borrowed time, their fragile peace balanced on the knife's edge of Luke's lie. The howl of the wind rose to a fever pitch, a sound of pure desolation. It was the sound of her own loneliness, her own fear. A tremor ran through her, a deep, uncontrollable shiver of terror and gratitude, and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. Without thinking, she reached across the small space that separated them and laid her hand on his. It was a small, hesitant touch, the tips of her fingers barely grazing the back of his rough, warm hand, but in the charged silence of the room, it felt like a shout. Luke went still. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The firelight played in his gray eyes, making them look deep and fathomless. Slowly, he turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. His touch was warm and strong, a solid anchor in the storm. The whole world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, to the space between them, thick with unspoken things. She whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind.
"I don't even know what love is."
His grip tightened slightly on her hand. His gaze held hers, and she saw his own ghosts looking back at her. "Neither did I," he answered, his voice a low, rough murmur. "Until I lost it." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The space between them disappeared. His face was close, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. She could see the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth. He was going to kiss her, and a part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, yearned for it with a desperate, aching need. But as his lips drew nearer, another image flashed in her mind, hot and sickening. Abernathy's face, flushed and leering. Jebediah's angry scowl. The cold, dead eyes of the merchant. A lifetime of being taken, of being used. An involuntary tremor shook her body. She flinched. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. He stopped instantly. The intensity in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound understanding. He didn't push, didn't question. He simply pulled back, releasing her hand and creating a space between them once more. He rose from his chair and went to add another log to the fire, his back to her. The moment was broken, the fragile connection shattered. He stood staring into the flames for a long time, silent but patient. And in his silence, Clara understood. He was giving her something more precious than a kiss. He was giving her a choice, and the time to heal enough to make it. The night he stepped back, leaving the space between them charged with a silent, aching question. Something shifted in Clara. The terror that had been her shadow for so long began to recede, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She had been a passive thing, a cork bobbing on a river of misfortune, pushed and pulled by the whims of others. Luke's patience, his quiet respect, had given her a patch of still water. Now, she was determined to learn how to swim. She would not be a guest. She would not be a charity case. She would earn her place, not just in his house, but in her own life. Her first battle was with the cast-iron stove. She resolved to make bread. Her first attempt was a dense, smoky rock that could have broken a tooth. She threw it to the chickens, who eyed it with suspicion before cautiously pecking at its charred crust. She wanted to weep with frustration, but instead, she took a deep breath, wiped the soot from her hands, and tried again. She remembered the way Luke's hands moved when he worked, with an economy of motion, a deliberate purpose. She tried to mimic it, kneading the dough with a steady rhythm, her mind focused on the feel of it coming to life beneath her palms. Luke found her staring into the oven, her face flushed with heat and anxiety. He said nothing, but he checked the flue, adjusted the damper slightly, and then sat at the table to clean a bridle, his quiet presence a form of encouragement. When she finally pulled the loaf out, it was a little lopsided, the crust a shade too dark, but it smelled of yeast and warmth and hope. That evening, they broke it together, and the simple act of eating something she had made, something that had not been given to her out of pity, was the most satisfying meal of her life. From bread, she moved to mending. In the cedar chest that held Sarah's dresses, she found a small sewing kit. Her fingers were clumsy with the needle, and she pricked herself more than once, leaving tiny dots of blood on the rough fabric of Luke's work shirt. But she persisted, her stitches small and uneven at first, then gradually becoming straighter, more confident. She was not just closing a tear in the cloth. She was stitching together the frayed edges of her own dignity. Her greatest challenge, and her deepest desire, was to learn to ride. The horses in the corral were powerful, intimidating creatures, symbols of a freedom she had only ever dreamed of. Luke owned two: Bess, the steady mare who pulled the wagon, and a tall gelding named Shadow, whose dark coat gleamed with a wild energy that both thrilled and terrified her. Luke began her lessons on Bess. "Just feel her move under you," he instructed, his voice calm as he led the mare in a slow circle. "She knows what to do. You just have to learn to trust her." Trust was a foreign country to Clara. Her first attempts to mount were awkward scrambles. Once in the saddle, she sat stiff as a board, her hands clutching the pommel in a white-knuckled grip. But Luke was endlessly patient, day after day. He led her around the corral, his hand resting lightly on the bridle, his low voice a constant, reassuring murmur. He taught her how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight, how to use the pressure of her legs to guide the animal. "It's a conversation," he told her. "You're not forcing him. You're asking." One afternoon, he handed her the reins. "She's yours," he said, stepping back. A jolt of panic shot through her, but she looked at the placid mare, felt the solid warmth of her beneath her, and took a breath. She gently nudged Bess with her heels. The mare took a step, then another. Clara rode the length of the corral and back, her body slowly learning the rhythm, the gentle sway. A smile, a real, unbidden smile, broke across her face. It felt like flying. She graduated from the corral to the open pasture, with Luke riding Shadow beside her. The world looked different from the back of a horse, vaster and more full of possibility. The wind in her hair felt like a blessing. She was no longer just surviving. She was learning, she was growing, she was earning her place. It was during her quest for more mending supplies that she made the discovery. The sewing kit from the cedar chest was nearly empty, and she thought there might be more thread or needles at the bottom. As she carefully lifted the neatly folded dresses and quilts, her fingers brushed against a hard, leather-bound book tucked into the corner. It was a journal. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that it belonged to Sarah. Her first instinct was to close the chest and forget she had ever seen it. It was a violation, a trespass into a grief that was not hers. But a stronger, more compelling urge took hold of her. To understand the silence in this house, to understand the man who had saved her, she needed to understand the woman he had lost. With trembling hands, she took the journal back to her small room and, by the light of a single candle, she began to read. Sarah's handwriting was a beautiful, looping script, full of life and joy. The early pages were filled with the simple, happy details of building a life with Luke. "He finished the roof today," she wrote. "His hands are so rough, but he was so gentle when he brushed a wood shaving from my hair. I love this land. I love this life. I love this man." Clara read about their hopes, their plans for the ranch, their small, private jokes. She felt a pang of jealousy so sharp it stole her breath, followed by a wave of profound sadness for the woman she would never know, for the love that had been lost. Then, the tone of the entries changed. They became filled with a new, breathless excitement. Sarah was with child. Clara read about her morning sickness, the first flutter of life she felt, the way Luke would press his ear to her belly at night, a look of awe on his face. "We will call him Daniel," Sarah wrote. "My little Daniel, my strong boy." The final entries were written in a shaky, frantic hand. The joy was gone, replaced by a desperate, prayerful fear. Daniel was born small but healthy, with a tuft of dark hair like his father's and eyes. Sarah wrote, "The color of a summer sky," but a fever came. It swept through the small house like a thief in the night. The last entry was almost illegible, the ink blurred by what could only have been tears. "The fever will not break. He is so small. His hand is so hot in mine. Luke is praying. God, hear our prayers." There were no more entries. Clara closed the journal. a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her own cheek. It all became clear. The empty rocking chair, the haunted look that sometimes came into Luke's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the profound, bone-deep silence that filled the spaces between his words. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost a son. He had lost his future. His heart was not just broken. It was buried, entombed under a mountain of guilt and what-ifs, a grief so immense he could not speak its name. He wasn't just quiet. He was haunted, and she, in her own brokenness, understood. A week later, the sky turned the color of a deep bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, and a strange, ominous stillness settled over the land. The storm, when it came, was not like the howling windstorm from before. This was a deluge. Rain fell in solid, relentless sheets, turning the dry, dusty earth into a thick, greedy mud. The creek at the bottom of the pasture, normally a gentle, meandering stream, began to swell, its waters turning a muddy, turbulent brown. Luke was out on the range, trying to move the small herd of cattle to higher ground before the low-lying areas flooded. He had told her to stay in the house, to keep the fire going, but as she watched the water rise, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The chicken coop was on a patch of low ground near the barn. The water was already lapping at its base. She couldn't just stand by and watch. Those chickens were her responsibility, her small contribution to this place. Pulling on Luke's heavy oilskin coat, she plunged into the storm. The rain was cold and blinding, the wind tearing at her. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and water. She reached the coop, the panicked squawking of the chickens audible even over the roar of the storm. She unlatched the door and began to shoo them towards the relative safety of the barn. It was as she herded the last of the hens that her foot slipped. She went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening crack. A sharp, white-hot bolt of pain shot up her leg, so intense it made her gasp. She tried to get up, but the moment she put weight on her foot, the world dissolved into a dizzying wave of agony. She was stranded, half submerged in the cold, rising water, with the rain beating down on her. She didn't know how long she lay there before she heard him shouting her name, his voice raw with panic. Through the sheets of rain, she saw him running towards her, his face a mask of terror. He reached her side, his eyes taking in her position, her unnaturally angled ankle. "Clara!" He knelt in the mud beside her, gently probing her leg. She cried out as his fingers brushed the injury. "It's broken," he said, his voice tight. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms. He was all solid muscle and surprising warmth. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, his long strides sure and steady even on the treacherous ground. He held her tight against his chest, shielding her from the worst of the rain, his own body soaked to the skin. Inside the house, he laid her gently on his own bed, the first time she had ever been in that part of the room. He worked quickly, his movements deft and focused. He stoked the fire until it blazed, then carefully cut away her wet, muddy dress with his pocket knife. He brought a basin of warm water and gently washed the mud from her skin, his touch impersonal and professional. Yet his hands, she noticed, were trembling. He set the ankle with a swift, agonizing movement, forcing a strangled cry from her lips, and then bound it tightly with strips of clean linen. By the time he was finished, a fever had taken hold of her. The world began to swim in and out of focus. She was cold, so cold, and her body ached with a deep, chattering chill. Luke covered her with every blanket in the house, but she couldn't stop shaking. He sat on the edge of the bed, forcing sips of hot broth between her lips, his face a blur of worried lines in the flickering firelight. The fever loosened her tongue, broke down the careful walls she had built around her heart. In her delirium, she looked at his strong, kind face, and all her deepest insecurities came pouring out in a ragged, feverish whisper.
"I'm sorry,"
she murmured, her teeth chattering.
"I just wanted to help. I just wanted to be worth something.
Hush now, he said softly, wiping her brow with a cool, damp cloth.
You are worth something?
No, she insisted, her eyes filling with hot, feverish tears.
I'm not pretty. I'm not clean. Not like she was.
She didn't have to say Sarah's name. It hung in the air between them.
I thought maybe if I was prettier,
or pure, you would think I was worth more. She saw a deep, profound grief wash over his face. It was the pain from the journal, the pain of losing Daniel, the pain of losing Sarah. It was a pain he had carried alone for 3 long years. He took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking the back of it. When he spoke, his voice was thick with a quiet, sorrowful emotion that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Worth isn't something you lose. Clara, he said, his gaze holding hers. It's something you fight to keep believing in. His words, spoken with such raw, simple truth, pierced through her fevered haze. He wasn't just talking about her. He was talking about himself. They were both fighting the same battle, trying to believe in their own worth in the face of a world that had tried to strip it from them. Her fever broke in the night. She woke in the gray light of dawn, her head clear, her body weak and sore, but her ankle throbbing with a dull, manageable ache. Luke was asleep in the rocking chair by the fire, his head slumped to one side, a blanket pulled loosely around his shoulders. He looked exhausted, and younger than she had ever seen him. She lay there, watching him, her heart filled with a feeling so powerful and overwhelming it felt like a physical ache in her chest. It was a mix of gratitude and a deep, tender longing that was completely new to her. When he finally stirred and opened his eyes, he found her watching him. He came over to the bed and felt her forehead. "Fever's gone," he said, his voice rough.
"Thank you, Luke,"
she said softly.
"For everything."
He just nodded, his gaze gentle. He sat on the edge of the bed, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with everything that had passed between them: the storm, the injury, her confession, his quiet, powerful words. This time, when he leaned in, she did not flinch. She met him halfway. The kiss was slow and hesitant, a soft, questioning touch of lips. It was not a kiss of passion or desire, but something deeper, more fragile. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared loneliness, of a desperate mutual longing to feel something other than pain. It was a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, they could learn to fight for their worth together. When he pulled back, he looked into her eyes, and she saw the hope he was so afraid to feel. But he still didn't ask her to be his bride. He didn't ask for anything at all. He just gave her a small, sad smile, and then went to make them both some coffee. Clara's ankle healed, but the memory of the storm and the intimacy it had forged between them lingered in the quiet spaces of the homestead. The hesitant kiss had been a question mark, hanging in the air between them, and in the weeks that followed, they moved around it with a careful, tender reverence. The unspoken thing was a fragile seed, and they were both afraid that a clumsy word or a hasty action might crush it before it had a chance to grow. But with her physical strength came a new kind of emotional fortitude. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a participant in her own life, and she felt an increasing need to face the world that had tried to break her. The larder was growing bare again, and this time when Luke announced he had to go to Redemption for supplies. Clara squared her shoulders.
"I'm coming with you,"
she said. It was not a request. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw the new determination there, the steel that had replaced some of the fear. He had seen her tame the stove, mend his clothes, and master the gentle rhythm of riding Bess. He knew she was no longer the terrified girl he had found shivering behind the stables. He gave a single, slow nod. All right. The journey into town was a silent one, but it was a different silence than before. It was not the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for words. Clara sat tall on the wagon seat, her hands folded in the lap of one of Sarah's plain calico dresses. She had braided her hair neatly, and though her heart beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs, she refused to let her fear show. She was Luke's equal, riding beside him, and she would present herself as such. But redemption had a long memory and a cruel tongue. The moment their wagon rolled onto the main street, a hush fell. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased. Men stopped their work to turn and stare. From behind curtained windows, she felt the burn of unseen eyes. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not just curiosity. It was a collective, palpable judgment. She was the runaway, the fallen woman, the source of scandal. Luke kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw set like granite. But Clara could feel the hostility like a physical force, pressing in on them from all sides. Inside the general store, the air was thick with it. The proprietor, a man with a sour, pinched face, served them with a grudging slowness, placing their items on the counter with deliberate, noisy thuds. A pair of women, who had been chatting by the bolt of fabric, fell silent and moved to the other side of the store, their whispers following them like the rustle of dry leaves. Clara's face grew hot with shame. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to become the invisible girl she had once been. But then she felt Luke's presence beside her, solid and unwavering. She remembered his words, spoken in the fevered dark. Worth isn't something you lose. It's something you fight to keep believing in. She lifted her chin a fraction of an inch and met the hostile stares with a quiet dignity she didn't know she possessed. As they were leaving the store, a woman in a severe black bonnet, the preacher's wife, was walking past. She took one look at Clara, her lips curling into a sneer of pious contempt, and deliberately spat on the dusty boardwalk. A mere inch from the toe of Clara's boot, the glob of spittle was a clear, unambiguous message. You are filth. Clara froze, the insult a slap in the face. Luke's body went rigid, and he took a step toward the woman, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Clara put a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. Don't, she whispered. She's not worth it. He looked down at her, his eyes blazing, but he allowed her to lead him away. Their ordeal was not over. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, a voice, slick with false cordiality, cut through the air. Well, look what the cat dragged in. I heard you taken up with a farmer. Girly. Looks like the stories are true. Clara's blood ran cold. She turned to see Silas Blackwood, the merchant who had bought her from her stepfather, leaning against a post, a cheap cigarillo clamped between his teeth. He looked her up and down, a smug, proprietary smirk on his face. He saw not a person, but a piece of merchandise that had gone astray. You've got a lot of nerve showing your face in this town, he continued, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of passers-by. He was playing to the crowd. Cost me a good bit of business. You did, running off like that. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. He lowered his voice to a venomous stage whisper, meant for everyone to hear. Running off like the whore who ran. The word, ugly and sharp, struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. It was the brand she had feared, the label the world had been determined to give her. She never saw Luke move. One moment he was standing by the wagon wheel, his body coiled with a terrible stillness. The next, he had closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. There was no shout, no warning, just the dull, wet crack of bone against bone as his fist connected with Blackwood's jaw. The merchant's head snapped back, the cigarillo flying from his lips. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with surprise, and crumpled into the dust in a heap. The street, which had been buzzing with whispers, fell into a shocked silence. Luke stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hadn't said a word, but his action had roared his defiance to the entire town. The silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. Deputy Miller came pushing through the gathering crowd, his face a grim mask of weary resignation. "Luke," he sighed, his voice heavy. "I warned you there'd be trouble." 2 other men were with him. They helped a groaning Silas Blackwood to his feet, while the deputy faced Luke. "You can't go around hitting people, no matter what they say. You know the law." "He had it coming," Luke said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Maybe so," the deputy conceded. "But that ain't for you to decide. You're under arrest for assault." Clara watched in horror as the deputy produced a pair of iron handcuffs. The metallic click as they closed around Luke's wrists was the sound of her world falling apart. He looked at her then, his gray eyes full of a fierce, protective light and a deep, unspoken apology. "Go home, Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." They led him away, toward the small stone building that served as the town jail. The crowd parted to let them pass, their faces a mixture of fear, excitement, and morbid satisfaction. Clara was left alone in the street, the object of 100 hostile stares. She felt stripped bare, vulnerable, utterly alone. With trembling hands, she finished loading the wagon, climbed onto the seat, and drove out of town, the dust rising behind her like the ashes of her newfound hope. The journey back to the homestead was the loneliest of her life. The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across the trail, turning familiar hills into crouching beasts. Every rustle in the grass, every cry of a distant bird, sounded like a threat. The ranch, which had become her sanctuary, now felt impossibly remote and exposed. Luke's words echoed in her mind. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." She did as he said. She barred the door of the small house, checked the latches on the windows, and sat at the table in the deepening twilight. The silence of the empty home pressing in on her. The hours crawled by. Night fell, dark and absolute. She tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every howl of the wind, sent a jolt of fear through her. It was close to midnight when she heard it. It wasn't the familiar sound of coyotes. It was the sound of horses, more than one, approaching at a walk, their hoofbeats muffled by the dusty earth. And then, voices, low, drunken, and ugly. Her heart leaped into her throat. She crept to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. 3 figures on horseback were silhouetted against the starry sky. As they drew closer, she recognized one of them, a bulky, stooped shape, Mr. Abernathy. "This is the place," he slurred, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "He's in jail. The girl's all alone." One of the other men laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Well, let's not keep her waiting. We've come to collect what's mine." Panic, cold and suffocating, threatened to drown her. Her first instinct was to hide, to crawl under the bed and pray they would go away. But then another thought, sharp and clear, cut through the fear. "This is my home." She would not let them take it. She would not let them take her. Her mind raced. She thought of the barn, the loft. It was the best place to hide. But this time, hiding was not enough. She slipped out the back door, moving like a shadow across the yard, and scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft. Her hands searched in the dark, her fingers brushing against the rough, familiar shapes of the tools Luke kept there. Her hand closed around the cold, smooth wood and steel of a rifle. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. She checked it the way Luke had shown her fingers moving with a clumsy but desperate certainty. It was loaded. From her vantage point, she could see them dismount and approach the house. They hammered on the door. "Come on out, girlie. We know you're in there." When there was no answer, Abernathy tried the knob, finding it locked. He and one of the other men put their shoulders to the door. The wood groaned in protest. Clara's heart was a wild, frantic bird in her chest, but her hands were steady. She would not run. She would not be a victim. She raised the rifle, the heavy stock awkward against her shoulder. She aimed not at them, but at the empty, star-filled sky above their heads. She took a deep breath, squeezed her eyes shut, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a roar that shattered the night's silence. The rifle kicked back hard, slamming into her shoulder and sending a jolt of pain through her. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and acrid in the air. Below, the men froze, startled. They looked around wildly, trying to pinpoint the source of the shot. "Who's out there?" one of them yelled, his voice suddenly shaky. Clara took another breath, forcing her voice out of her tight throat. It came out shaking but clear as a bell, ringing with a power she never knew she possessed. "Get off this land." They saw her then, a small, determined silhouette in the dark opening of the hayloft, the long barrel of the rifle glinting in the starlight. "That's just the girl," Abernathy scoffed, though he made no move to advance. "I have another bullet," Clara called out, her voice gaining strength. "And this one won't be for the sky. Take one more step toward that house, and I swear to God, I will shoot." They stared up at her, a strange tableau of drunken bullies and a lone, determined girl. They had come expecting a frightened, helpless victim. They had not expected this. They had not expected a fight. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, one of the men began to back away. "She's crazy," he muttered. "This ain't worth getting shot over." Abernathy hesitated, his face a mask of frustration and thwarted rage. But he was a coward at heart. He looked from the dark, unyielding barrel of the rifle to his retreating friends. With a final, venomous curse, he turned and lumbered back to his horse. "This ain't over," he shouted back at her. "We'll be back." She watched them ride away, their threats fading into the night, until the sound of their hoofbeats was gone completely. Only then did she allow the rifle to sink, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She slid down to the floor of the loft, pulling her knees to her chest. And finally, the tears came. They were not the tears of a victim, but the hot, ragged tears of a warrior after a long, hard battle. She wept for her fear, for her loneliness, for the terrifying strength she had found within herself. She wept, but she was proud. She spent the rest of the night awake in the loft, the rifle resting across her lap. She did not dare to sleep. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep over the eastern hills, a new resolve settled in her heart. This was not over. They would be back. Luke was in jail because of her. She could not just wait for the world to decide her fate. She had to claim it herself. At dawn, she climbed down from the loft. She didn't bother to wash her face or change her torn dress. She went to the corral, saddled Shadow, the tall, spirited gelding she had never dared to ride alone, and swung herself onto his back, with her dress torn, her hair wild in the wind, and a look of fierce determination on her face. She urged the horse into a gallop and rode toward town. She didn't stop until she reached the sheriff's office. She slid off the horse, her legs shaking, and marched up the steps. She pushed open the door without knocking. The sheriff, a portly, gray-haired man named Thompson, looked up from his desk in surprise. Deputy Miller stood beside him, a cup of coffee in his hand. "I need to see you," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "My name is Clara. You have my friend, Luke, in your jail. I want him released." Sheriff Thompson leaned back in his chair, a small, patronizing smile on his face. "That's not how it works. Miss, he assaulted a man. There will be a hearing." "It was in my defense," Clara said, her voice rising. "That man, Blackwood, he sold me. The man he delivered me to, Mr. Abernathy. He came to the ranch last night with 2 other men. They tried to break down my door." The deputy's face paled. "Is this true?" "They would have taken me if I hadn't fired a shot," Clara continued, her eyes fixed on the sheriff. "They will be back. This will not end until you do something." She took a step closer to the desk, her hands clenched at her sides. She was about to make the biggest gamble of her life, offering the only thing she had left to bargain with, her own story, her own shame. "I'll strike a deal with you, Sheriff." "A deal?" he asked, intrigued. "Let Luke go, today, and I will stand up in front of the whole town, in a public court or in the church. I don't care where. I will tell them everything. I will tell them how my stepfather sold me for a watch and a sack of flour. I will tell them how Mr. Abernathy locked me in a room, and I will testify against the men who came to my home last night. I will give you your criminals. In exchange, you'll give me Luke's freedom." Sheriff Thompson's deal was a gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than Clara's soul. He had agreed, his initial skepticism giving way to a grudging respect for the steely resolve in her eyes. Word had been sent to the circuit judge, who was fortunately in a neighboring county, and agreed to preside over an immediate and unusual public hearing. The town of Redemption, starved for drama, was about to get a feast. The hearing was held in the saloon. It was the only building, aside from the yet unbuilt church, large enough to hold the crush of curious townsfolk. The tables were pushed to the walls, and rows of benches were brought in. The air, usually thick with the smell of stale beer and smoke, was now charged with a different kind of intoxicating vapor, anticipation and judgment. The place was packed, a sea of weathered faces, calico bonnets, and suspendered shoulders. Clara sat on a hard wooden chair near the front, beside Deputy Miller. Across the room sat Silas Blackwood and Mr. Abernathy, flanked by the two louts who had accompanied Abernathy to the ranch. They looked smug, confident that the ramblings of a runaway girl would hold no weight against the word of established men. Then they brought Luke in. His hands were unbound, but he was escorted by two men. He was not put in a seat of honor, nor was he placed with the accused. He was simply led to the back of the room, where he stood against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was a stoic mask, but his gray eyes found Clara's across the crowded room, and in their depths, she saw a universe of trust and fear. He was putting his faith in her, and the weight of that trust was both a terrible burden and a source of incredible strength. The judge, a man named Henderson with a severe face and a sweeping white mustache, banged a gavel on the makeshift bench. "The saloon's bar. This hearing is now in session," he announced, his voice booming through the room. "The purpose of this gathering is to hear the testimony of one Miss Clara regarding the events that led to the arrest of Mr. Luke and the subsequent allegations she has made against Mr. Abernathy, Mr. Blackwood, and others. Miss Clara, please rise." Clara stood, her legs feeling like water. The dress she wore was one of Sarah's, a simple brown calico, clean and mended. It was her armor. She clutched her hands together to stop their trembling. The sea of faces swam before her, a blur of hostile, curious, and indifferent expressions. She felt 100 judgments being passed upon her before she had even spoken a word. Her throat was sandpaper. "State your name for the record," the judge commanded. "My name is Clara," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. The judge motioned for her to speak up. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes finding Luke's at the back of the room. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the encouragement she needed. "My name is Clara," she said again, her voice louder, clearer, though it still shook. "And I was sold." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The simple, brutal statement hung in the air, stripped of any artifice. "I was sold by my stepfather, Jebediah, to that man there." She raised a trembling hand and pointed at Silas Blackwood. "He paid for me with a sack of flour and a silver watch. He treated me like livestock, and he brought me here, to this town, and delivered me to him." Her finger moved to point at Mr. Abernathy, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "He told me I was to be his bride," Clara continued, her voice gaining a desperate momentum as the ugly memories poured out. But I was not a bride. I was a prisoner. He locked me in a room at night. He yelled at me when I burned his food. He raised his hand to me when I displeased him. He told me he owned me, that he had a bill of sale to prove it. From the crowd, a man jeered. "Sounds like a drunken tale to me." A few others laughed nervously. Clara flinched as if struck, but she did not stop. On the day he was to force me into a marriage, in this very room, he tried to hit me. Luke, Luke, he stepped in. He told him to stop. He didn't lay a hand on him. Abernathy was drunk and angry, and he fell and hit his head. I saw my chance, and I ran. I ran because I was terrified. I ran because I would rather die in the wilderness than live as that man's property. The room was quieter now. The faces were no longer mocking. They were watching her, listening. She told them about Luke finding her behind the stables, about his quiet kindness, about the long, silent ride to his homestead. She told them how he had given her shelter and asked for nothing in return.
"He gave me a home,"
she said, her voice thick with emotion.
"He gave me safety. And then, 2 nights ago, after the deputy arrested him for defending me, Mr. Abernathy came to that home. He was not alone."
She looked at the 2 other men, who now refused to meet her gaze, staring intently at the floorboards.
"They came in the dark. They thought I was a helpless girl, all alone. They came to claim what's theirs,"
they said. They tried to break down the door. A gasp went through the room. This was not an old story of a transaction gone wrong. This was a new, immediate threat, something that had happened in their own backyard. Abernathy surged to his feet.
"She's lying. The girl is hysterical. She's a thief and a—"
"Sit down and be silent, sir, or I will have you held in contempt," Judge Henderson roared, banging his gavel. Abernathy sank back into his chair, sputtering. The judge turned his stern gaze back to Clara. "Continue, Miss—" Clara's composure was beginning to crumble. The act of speaking these horrors aloud was like tearing open a wound. She looked toward the section where the town's more respectable ladies sat. She saw the preacher's wife, the same woman who had spat near her boots. The woman was staring at her, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. The judgment in her eyes was a fresh wound. The shame of it all, the humiliation of laying her life bare for these people to pick over, was suddenly too much. Her voice faltered.
I know what you all think of me,"
she stammered, tears beginning to well in her eyes.
"We think you're a liar,"
a voice called out. Before the judge could respond,
"A surprising thing happened."
The preacher's wife stood up. Her back was ramrod straight. She did not look at Clara. She looked at the man who had shouted. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the room with the authority of the pulpit.
"Let the girl speak,"
she said. The room fell into a stunned silence. The woman turned her gaze to Judge Henderson. "Let her finish her testimony. We will hear all of it." She then sat down, her hands folded primly in her lap, her face a mask of grim resolve. It was not an act of kindness, but an act of justice, and it was more powerful than any weapon. The interruption gave Clara the strength to continue. She took another shaky breath. The hardest part was yet to come.
That man called me a whore,"
she said, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. "Because I was a woman who ran away, who lived in a man's house without being his wife. But I want you all to know." She looked toward the back of the room, her eyes finding Luke's once more. He had not moved, a silent stone pillar in a swirling sea of emotion. The tears that had threatened now began to fall, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Her voice broke, shattering into a sob. "I want you to know that in all the weeks I have lived under his roof, in his home, alone with him miles from any other soul, that man has never once laid a hand on me without my permission. He has never touched me with anything but respect. He fed me when I was hungry. He clothed me when I had nothing. He protected me when I was in danger. He treated me like I was a person. The confession, the raw, sob-choked truth of it, landed in the silent room with devastating force. It was the one detail that could not be invented, the one truth that shined with an undeniable light. It was the story of a decency so profound it shamed every leering stare, every ugly whisper, every ounce of judgment in the room. Clara broke down completely then, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her weeping. She had nothing left. She had poured out her entire broken heart onto the dusty floor of the saloon. She composed herself one last time, lifting her tear-stained face to the judge. Her voice was a whisper, but in the dead silence, everyone heard it.
"I don't know what it means to be a bride,"
she said, her words a simple, powerful testament.
"But I know what it means to be safe, and I'd die to protect that."
She was finished. She sank back into her chair, emotionally and physically spent, and let the silence of the room wash over her. Judge Henderson stared at her for a long, quiet moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his gaze, as cold and hard as iron, upon the accused men. He did not need to deliberate. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. "Silas Blackwood," he began, his voice like the crack of doom. "The buying and selling of human beings, under any guise, is a repugnant and unlawful act. You will return the money you received from Mr. Abernathy, and you will pay a fine to this court so steep it will remind you every day for the next year that people are not property." He then turned to Abernathy, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mr. Abernathy, for your part in this disgusting transaction, and for the terror you inflicted upon this young woman, you and your companions will spend the next 6 months in the county jail. It will give you ample time to contemplate the difference between a wife and a possession. Deputy, take them into custody." Abernathy and the others were hauled to their feet. Their smug confidence evaporated, replaced by shock and sputtering rage. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as they were led away. The story of redemption would now have a new chapter. Finally, the judge looked at Clara. His severe expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice softer, "by the authority vested in me by this territory, I declare you a free woman. You are under no man's ownership. You are free to go where you will, and any man who tries to hinder you will answer to the law." He paused, then looked toward the back of the room. "Luke, you are free to go. The charge of assault is dismissed." As the room began to erupt in a buzz of conversation, Deputy Miller approached Clara. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked deeply ashamed. "Miss," he said, his voice low, "I apologize. I should have listened. I should have done more." Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not a threat, but just a man trying to do his job in a world that wasn't always simple. She gave a small nod of acceptance. Luke was making his way through the crowd. He didn't rush. He moved with the same deliberate pace as always. He reached her side, his eyes asking a question she couldn't answer. He held out his hand. She took it, and his warm, strong fingers closed around hers. Without a word, they turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the noise and the judgment of the town behind them. The ride back to the homestead was as silent as the first time they had made the journey. But this time, the silence was not born of fear or uncertainty. It was a deep, shared quiet, a space for the raw, jangled emotions of the day to settle. The sun was setting, casting a golden, forgiving light over the land. They were leaving redemption behind and heading home. Back at the ranch, the familiar quiet of the house wrapped around them like a comforting blanket, while Clara stirred the embers in the hearth, bringing the fire back to life. Luke stood by the window, looking out at the darkening hills. After a long time, he turned to her. In his hands, he held a small box, inexpertly wrapped in a piece of brown paper and tied with twine. His face was serious, his eyes full of a new, vulnerable light. "Clara," he began, his voice a little rough. "There's something for you." He held the box out to her. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. It was light. She slowly untied the twine and unfolded the paper. Inside was a simple wooden box. She lifted the lid. Nestled on a piece of dark velvet was a ring. It was not fancy. It was a simple, thin band of silver, hammered into a slightly imperfect circle. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Beneath the ring was a folded piece of paper, a letter. She opened it. The handwriting was Luke's, strong and plain, like the man himself. "Clara," it began, "you were never mine to own. I know that. From the first moment I saw you, all I wanted was to see you free. Today, I watched you claim that freedom for yourself, and I have never seen anything braver in my entire life. You are the reason I have started to feel again, the reason the silence in this house no longer feels so empty. You are the reason I want to start again. If you'll have me, not as your savior, but your equal, I'd be honored to learn what it means to love beside you." The tears she thought had all been spent in the courtroom came again. But these were different. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking joy. They streamed down her face as she looked up at him, this quiet, decent man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. He was watching her, his heart in his eyes, waiting for her answer.
"Yes,"
she whispered, the word a sob and a prayer.
"Oh, Luke, yes."
He took a step toward her, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his face, and she held up a hand to stop him. "But not yet," she added softly. The smile faltered, replaced by a look of gentle confusion.
"Luke,"
she said, her voice growing stronger as she found the words.
"Today, for the first time, I felt like a whole person, not someone's daughter or someone's property or someone's charity case. Just me, Clara, and I need to get to know her a little longer. I need to know who I am when I am not running, or fighting, or afraid. When I marry you, I want to come to you as your equal in every way. I want to build myself first." He looked at her, and the understanding that dawned in his eyes was so complete, so full of love and respect, that it took her breath away. He nodded slowly, the smile returning, softer and deeper this time. He had offered her a future, and she, in her own way, had just defined its terms. He had asked for an equal, and that is exactly what she intended to be. The months that followed the hearing were a season of quiet mending, for the land and for the soul. The raw, open wound of Clara's public testimony slowly began to scar over, not with the hard, ugly tissue of shame, but with the tougher, more resilient fiber of self-respect. Her deal with the sheriff had freed Luke, but her testimony had freed herself. She had taken the ugliest parts of her life and held them up to the light, and in doing so, had robbed them of their power to haunt her in the dark. Summer blazed across the high plains, and under the relentless sun, the ranch thrived. Luke, with Clara now a steady and willing partner, worked with a renewed purpose. They mended fences that had sagged with years of neglect, their hammers ringing in a steady, companionable rhythm. They cleared a new patch of land for a larger vegetable garden, their hands working together in the rich, dark earth. Clara, who had once struggled to pull a weed, now knew the satisfaction of planting a seed and watching it grow. The work was hard, blistering her hands and tiring her muscles, but it was honest work. It was creation. Every post set, every row hoed, was a testament to their shared will to build something new from the broken pieces of the past. The simple physical act of labor was a balm, grounding her in the present and giving her a tangible stake in her own future. She learned to ride Shadow, the spirited gelding, with a confidence that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She no longer clung to the pommel with fear, but moved with the horse, a fluid extension of its power and grace. She would ride out alone for hours, exploring the rolling hills and hidden gullies of Luke's land,
feeling the wind tear at her hair and the sun warm on her face. Out there, with the vast, empty sky above and the solid, living creature beneath her, she was not a runaway or a victim. She was just a woman, alone and unafraid, mapping the boundaries of her own courage. The trips to redemption became a regular occurrence, and a measure of her progress. The first time she and Luke returned after the hearing, the town still treated them with a cautious distance. The whispers had stopped, but the stares remained. Yet, Clara held her head high. She was no longer a scandal. She was a homesteader, a woman of business. She learned to trade her surplus eggs and vegetables at the general store, her voice clear and steady as she bartered with the same pinched-faced proprietor who had once barely acknowledged her existence. He, like the rest of the town, had begun to see her not for the story that had brought her to them, but for the person she was becoming. One afternoon, the preacher's wife, the woman who had spat near her boot, stopped her on the boardwalk. Clara braced herself for another sermon of silent contempt. But the woman's face was different, her expression softened by a grudging respect. "Your garden is thriving, I hear," she said, her voice stiff but not unkind. "My Martha has been struggling with blight on her tomatoes." Clara, surprised, found herself offering a simple piece of advice Luke had taught her about using wood ash to protect the plants. The woman listened, nodded, and then, after a moment's hesitation, said, "Thank you, Clara." The use of her name, spoken without malice, was a small but significant truce. The town was healing, and she was a part of that healing. At night, after the long days of physical labor, she discovered a different kind of world in the small collection of books on Luke's shelf. There were books on agriculture and animal husbandry, but there were also novels by Hawthorne and Cooper, and a thin volume of poetry by a woman named Dickinson. Her reading was slow and halting at first, her finger tracing the words as she sounded them out. But with each page, a new universe opened up to her. The books were a window out of the small cabin, a journey into the minds and hearts of other people. They taught her that her own loneliness, her own longings and fears, were not hers alone. They were part of the human condition. She was not an outcast. She was just a person, living a story. Her greatest victory, however, came not from the land or from books, but from another human soul, one of her neighbors, a quiet family named Miller who had a small ranch a few miles away, had a young daughter named Lily. The girl was about 10 years old, with wide, curious eyes and a shy smile. Lily was bright, but she struggled with her letters. The small, overworked schoolmarm in town had little time for students who fell behind. One day, when Mrs. Miller came to trade for some of Clara's preserves, she confessed her worries about her daughter. "She just can't seem to get the hang of it," she said with a sigh. "I'm afraid she'll grow up not knowing how to read her own name." Clara saw in Lily's downcast face a reflection of her own past, a life lived in the shadow of ignorance, where the world is a book written in a language you cannot understand. "I could try to help," Clara offered, the words coming out before she had time to doubt them. "If you'll let me." And so, twice a week, Lily would ride over to the homestead. They would sit at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had once confessed her own inadequacies to Luke, and they would work. Clara was patient. She remembered her own struggles, the frustration of staring at meaningless squiggles on a page. She made a game of it, drawing letters in a pan of flour, spelling out the names of the chickens, slowly, painstakingly. The squiggles began to make sense to Lily. The day the little girl read her first full sentence aloud from one of Luke's almanacs, "A cold winter follows a dry summer," her face lit up with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. In that moment, Clara felt a joy so profound it was almost painful. In teaching Lily, she was breaking the last chain of her own past. She was no longer just a recipient of kindness. She was a giver of it. The silence and shame that had defined her for so long were being replaced, word by the quiet confidence of knowledge. The seasons turned. The gold and crimson of autumn gave way to the stark white silence of winter. The small house was their sanctuary against the biting winds and heavy snows. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, to the warmth of the fire, the taste of preserved vegetables, and the quiet, comfortable presence of each other. They talked more during those long winter nights, sharing stories from their pasts, their small hopes for the future. He told her about his parents, about his dream of building the ranch. She told him about her mother, about the small wooden bird her stepfather had carved for her so long ago. The silver ring he had given her lay in the wooden box beside her cot. She looked at it every night before she slept, a quiet promise waiting for the right season. Spring arrived in a rush of green and gold. The creek swelled with melted snow. The meadowlarks returned, and the air grew soft with the scent of damp earth and new life. Everything felt new, washed clean, full of possibility. One bright spring morning, Luke came into the house after finishing the morning chores and found Clara sitting in the rocking chair by the open window. The morning sun streamed in, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air and casting a halo around her hair. She was mending a dress. It was a simple blue cotton, but she was carefully stitching a line of delicate white lace, salvaged from one of Sarah's finer garments. Around the collar, the dress was not a practical work garment. It was something for a special occasion. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his heart aching with a love so deep and quiet it felt like prayer. He had watched her transform, had seen the frightened, broken girl blossom into this strong, capable, beautiful woman. He had given her a safe place to land, but she was the one who had taught herself to fly. She looked up, as if sensing his presence, and a small, shy smile touched her lips. She held up the dress, the needle still poised in her hand. "I was thinking," she said, her voice soft. "I was thinking that it's time." He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her free hand in his. It was no longer the soft, unused hand of a girl, but the capable, calloused hand of a woman who knew her own strength. She looked into his eyes, her own shining with a clear, steady light. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, joyful certainty. "I don't know how to be a bride," she said, the words an echo from a lifetime ago. "But I want to learn, with you." They were married 3 weeks later. On a warm afternoon in late May, they stood under the sprawling branches of a giant cottonwood tree down by the creek, its leaves whispering in the gentle breeze. There was no preacher, just the circuit judge, Henderson, who had made a special trip out. His severe face softened by a genuine smile. Their guests were few but chosen. Deputy Miller was there with his wife. The Miller family came, their daughter Lily holding a small, hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers. And, to Clara's quiet surprise, the preacher's wife was there, sitting on a wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, a silent witness to the grace she had once been so quick to condemn. Clara wore the blue dress with the lace trim. Luke wore a clean shirt and a look of such profound love and awe that it made her heart feel as if it might burst. They didn't exchange fancy vows, just simple, honest promises. To honor, to protect, to cherish, to be equals. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Luke leaned down and kissed her. A slow, tender kiss, full of all the unspoken words, all the shared sorrows, and all the patient hope that had brought them to this moment. That night, the house was filled with a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness or grief, but the sacred humming silence of a shared life just beginning. As the last sliver of the sun sank behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of dusky rose and violet, Clara stood before the small mirror in their bedroom. Luke came and stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Their eyes met in the reflection. Slowly, she began to unpin her hair, letting it fall in a cascade of brown waves over her shoulders. She turned to face him, her heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rugged lines of his jaw. She saw the question in his eyes, the gentle concern, the desire to be careful with her, to protect her even now. She gave him a small, soft smile, a smile of absolute trust and utter certainty.
Don't be gentle,
she whispered, her voice full of a deep, quiet yearning.
Just be real.
He understood. He was not to handle her as if she were a fragile, broken thing. He was to meet her as she was, whole, healed, and his equal. Their coming together was a slow, emotional discovery, a mapping of scars and a healing of old wounds. It was a communion not just of bodies, but of souls, a quiet, desperate, and beautiful affirmation of life and love in the face of all the cruelty the world had shown them. It was not the frantic heat of passion, but the deep, slow burn of trust, of gratitude, of a profound and sacred yearning to be truly known by another. It was a silent promise that the past was finally, truly, in the past. The next morning, Clara woke to the feeling of the sun on her face and the solid, comforting weight of Luke's arm around her. She lay there for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. For the first time in her life, she felt no fear. She felt no shame. She felt only a deep, abiding sense of peace. She was home. She was loved. She knew, finally, exactly who she was. Later that day, after Luke had gone out to the barn, Clara sat at the kitchen table. The sunlight streamed through the clean window pane. She opened a new, leather-bound journal, a wedding gift from Luke. She dipped a pen in a fresh pot of ink and wrote the first words on the first clean, white page. It was not Sarah's story. It was hers. A slow smile spread across her face as she wrote, the words flowing clear and strong from her heart. I am not what they made me. I am what I choose to become. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please feel free to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.